Well, it is the best of times. It is not the worst of times, but it is also the most dangerous of times.
Okay.
And so what we do have is, in absolute terms, we are far better off than our ancestors were. There's no question about this. In many different ways, some of which are hard to measure. The fact that you have a device in your pocket that can access something that far outstrips the Great Library of Alexandria in terms of the level of information that it puts in your hands is something that it doesn't matter how wealthy you were in 1960, you didn't have anything like that access. So we are, in absolute terms, in many ways, just simply best off of any generation. On the other hand, the well-being is very unevenly distributed. And we get tangled around this issue a lot. For one thing, we have post-traumatic stress disorder in the U.S. and I guess in Britain too about communism. And so we have this perennial fight about the distribution of wealth, and anybody who argues that the distribution of wealth is counterproductive risks being dismissed as advocating an even distribution of wealth. And what I would say is actually some skew in the distribution of wealth is part of the engine that fuels our collective well-being. That is to say, it's just simply part of the incentive structure that causes people to strive and to generate things that place all of us at advantage. But there's diminishing returns on that process. And the level of skew that we have in the distribution of wealth is counterproductive. And it leaves a lot of people unfortunately predisposed to see us as very poor, right? Because the human mind is constructed by evolution to take relative well-being much more seriously than it takes absolute well-being. In other words, we are wired to register inequality. And there's a good reason for that. You know, if you imagine a scenario in the ancestral past, if you were, let's say, an early farmer, let's say it's 8,000 years ago, and you're farming a piece of land, and you look over the border to your neighbor's piece of land, and your neighbor is far exceeding your capacity at harvest, but they're on a similar patch of territory, that's a strong indication that you aren't doing something well. Maybe they've discovered some method that increases their yield, like crop rotation. Maybe they've got some sort of a device that helps them leverage their efforts, so they might have a wheel. But in any case, you should be focused on the fact that they're out-competing you, because you might learn what it is that they know that you don't and employ it yourself to good effect. So that makes us very sensitive to others doing better than we are. And unfortunately, we all have these devices in our lives that allow us to peer into the lives of other people who are not our neighbors. And so the fact that they may be doing better than we are has no implication whatsoever for whether or not we are missing some opportunity. But nonetheless, our evolutionary programming causes us to take this as an evidence that something is wrong, and many people have focused on the idea that what is wrong is an unfairness in the system, which often it is, but not always. So what I would point to, though, is although we can fight about whether or not an uneven distribution of wealth is something that should be tolerated, and I would argue some inequality in the distribution of wealth is desirable. But we can also argue about what level is tolerable. What we can't argue about is whether a concentration in the distribution of opportunity is a good thing. And this is where I think these protest movements have resonated so broadly, is that there is a sense in the U.S. and farther afield that opportunity is not available to many people, and that the distribution of opportunity is strongly predicted by things like race. So this is undeniably true in the U.S., and the problem is people are drawing the wrong lesson from it. They are imagining that because opportunity is unevenly distributed, which is, I would argue, inherently bad, because it is unevenly distributed, and because it is unevenly distributed by race, it must be racism that is causing that inequality. And it is that misunderstanding that I believe is fueling the Black Lives Matter movement and causing increasing chaos in the U.S.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, because, I mean, like, this is one of those things where, like, I often say, like, I don't, this may sound weird to some people, but, like, I don't care about wealth inequality. I care about poverty, but wealth inequality itself, like, if, look, there are people who earn 10,000 times as much money as me, or who have 10,000 times as much wealth as me. And that's fine. I don't care. If they obtained it by legal methods, then that's okay. I'm concerned about poverty. I'm concerned about people not having enough at an absolute level, or as you said, when it comes to opportunity, if people are being unfairly discriminated against, or if they don't have access to certain opportunities, etc. I agree that that's a major problem. But my personal take, and I've felt like this, I kind of felt like this since I was a child, is I've always felt like I've never totally understood the focus on gaps. I feel like as a society, we focus on gaps and inequalities too much rather than looking at things on an individual level. And I think that when you focus on gaps and you focus on always comparing yourselves to other people on an individual level or even on a group level, I just think that's a recipe for permanent misery and resentment and coveting and jealousy, etc. I mean, I think a lot of stuff, as you sort of alluded to, I think a lot of stuff is being driven by people's emotions, and I would perhaps argue like a bit of a paucity of morality, and people not sort of valuing the right things. But I feel like that's it's sort of a never-ending game because, you know, nature is very unequal in so many ways, right? We're all totally different, and people are in different places. People do have different opportunities. People come from different backgrounds, have different capabilities. Some people work a lot harder than other people, etc. So, but I don't know. I feel like we focus too much on the gaps. And for example, when you get a lot of left-wing politicians or activists, right, they'll just make a statement, just, you know, the top 5% of people in America own as much wealth as the bottom 60% or something like that. I don't know what the numbers are. And that in itself is their point. Like, I hear that and I'm like, yeah, so what? So maybe there's something I'm greatly missing here as to why that's a gigantic issue past an emotional level. But to me, it's not. I like your idea of talking about the opportunity distribution. I think that's a more interesting concept. But is there something that I'm missing here when it comes to the income or wealth distribution, or are people focusing on the wrong thing?
I think they're focusing on the wrong thing, but I also think that there's something that you're missing that is worth taking into consideration.
Please
which
let me know.
is, if you imagine that the reason that an unequal distribution of wealth is something that should not upset us, is that it is the ability to earn more wealth that incentivizes people to solve problems that we want solved, right? To deliver us art, to deliver us insight, to act in ways that extend our compassion, right? If we want those things done, and it is the ability to earn that causes people to do them, then we have to look at the wealth that has accumulated and say, how much more good could have been done if it was more evenly distributed? In other words, let's look at a Jeff Bezos, and let's, in my opinion, be generous to Jeff Bezos and imagine that he has done an awful lot of good to make himself wealthy. Would he have done it for $1 billion? My guess is he would have done everything he had done for $1 billion if the entire thing was rescaled. And so if we take all of the residual, and I must admit I don't know how much wealth he has now.
About 100 billion plus, I think.
I believe that is the right order of magnitude. So if we were to imagine that $99 billion of his wealth was unnecessary in order to motivate him to do all of the positive things that he has done, then the question is, okay, what could you do with $99 billion worth of incentive pointed at people who don't have an opportunity to advance the ball for us collectively? And the answer is quite a lot. So it is not that we should be troubled by how well Jeff Bezos lives. Who cares, as you point out? What we should be troubled by is that we are not getting a good return on our investment with respect to the incentive to strive. If people had better access to the things that make you capable of innovating, and they had access to the incentives which have concentrated in a small number of hands, but could be offered to a larger number of people, then civilization would be better, because a lot more innovations that we might have would actually come into existence.
Yeah. I mean, I don't fundamentally disagree with that, but ultimately that's his money, right? That's his rightly earned money. And that 99 billion, I don't believe anyone has any right whatsoever to take or confiscate that from him. If he charitably chooses to, be a philanthropist and give away $99 billion, all power to him. But I've never understood the mentality that somehow people feel that they are entitled to that. I don't understand that.
Well, I mean, I think it's more complex than that. I'm not
Okay.
excited about recapturing the wealth that rich people have and redistributing it. I don't think it's the right place to focus. I'm interested in fixing the system so that to the extent that wealth accumulates in a counterproductive or suboptimal way, that it stops happening. But let's look at Bezos, since we're on this topic.
Yeah, sure. I'm curious.
One thing that Bezos has done with Amazon is he has run a very aggressive business that drives out its competitors, not by being superior, but by being so well resourced that it is going to outlive them while losing money. And this is actually, or at least was, illegal in a world where we enforced antitrust provisions. You're not allowed to drive out your competitors by selling at a loss in order that once they're gone, you can jack up prices later, right? That's gaming of the system. That's rent seeking. And so to the extent that what Amazon has done has provided effectively a huge bargain for customers that is not itself economically sustainable, and it has done this in the interest of driving out every competitor and becoming a monopoly in the future, that is destructive of the system that allows people to earn and that causes them to innovate. So we shouldn't want that to occur. And frankly, we should reinstate the provisions that enforce the antitrust laws so that this behavior is unprofitable. In other words, we should force Jeff Bezos to compete on a level playing field in which we all understand the rules and in which, others have a shot. We don't want to provide advantages to Goliath. Frankly, we'd like to provide advantages to David. And so when you say it's his money, why do people have designs on it? In part, it's his money because he's played hardball and violated the spirit of capitalism in order to gain all of that wealth. And I can't blame him for doing it to the extent that it was apparently within the rules. He played hardball, but we should change the rules.